So, this morning we are getting back into our study of John as we've been walking through the Gospel of John. Now, if my math is correct, this is actually our 52nd week that we have spent in John. We've, of course, taken a week here and there off for different reasons, but if you were to pile them all together, this would be a full year now, and we've only got 3 chapters left. So, we're looking to get done this year. We started it in January 2020, so God willing, we'll get through it here in the next couple months for sure. But we are getting back into it. To remind you, we're back in John 18. Jesus had completed his Passover meal with his disciples. They had sung a hymn, which is traditional after the Passover meal, most likely the Psalms of Hallel, the 113 through 118. And 118, we talked about how probably specifically they sang, because Peter references it and Stephen references it in their testimonies before the Jewish leaders, that the stone that you have rejected has become the chief cornerstone, is laid out in Psalm 118, that they had sung this hymn, and then they left Jerusalem and crossed over the Kidron Valley and gone up to the Mount of Olives, to a place called Gethsemane, literally the oil press. And there Jesus gathered. It was the common place for him to go throughout this week, this Passover week, to gather with his disciples and to pray. But we notice that little foreshadowing. Oftentimes there's it's called typology, right? These types of Christ that are in the Old Testament that serve as a way of foreshadowing who the Messiah was going to be. That we looked at how David went through the same experience, right? That he was betrayed by someone close to him, that he was rejected by his nation, that he actually fled Jerusalem and crossed the Kidron up to the Mount of Olives also. I've got, don't have anything, because I know you can't be bribed, but I was going to have candy bars or some Schrute bucks to give out if anyone can name who David's betrayer was, who suffered coincidentally, right, the exact same fate as Jesus' betrayer Judas, who went and hung himself. This guy who betrayed David also. Ahithophel was his name. I didn't name him, but that was his name. So Ahithophel and Judas, 1,000 years before, the same story happens in the life of David, where he's betrayed by someone close to him. He flees Jerusalem, crosses the Kidron, up the Mount of Olives, and both the betrayers suffer the same fate, that they hang themselves. And this is what comes to pass with Jesus. He goes to Gethsemane with his disciples, as he has every night of the Passover, and he goes there to pray. And this night specifically, he prays, "May this cup pass." We've talked about how Jesus was severely troubled during this prayer, during this time, and answering that question of why is it that Jesus is so troubled, so worried, when other Christians have gone to their death as martyrs confidently and boldly. And here's Jesus, and he's worried to the point that he's sweating blood. He's so stressed and troubled. That's because of this cup, right? That yes, other people have gone to their deaths as martyrs, proclaiming faith in Jesus, but no one else has taken the sins of the world upon themselves. That's the cup of God's wrath that Jesus was enduring on our behalf, that he who knew no sin, who had committed no sin, actually became sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God. That somehow, in a way that we can't really understand or explain, Jesus was separated from the Father and took on the sin of the world. He prayed for that cup to pass, but not his will be done, the Father's will, and knowing fully that there was no other way for him to accomplish our salvation than for him to drink that cup. We saw that Judas arrived then with the temple police, Jewish leaders, with the Roman soldiers, knowing exactly where to go because Jesus went there every night, and Jesus knew Judas would find him there, and that's why he went there. Judas shows up with his band and betrays Jesus, and they come, and Jesus asks, "Who is it you're seeking?" And they say, "Jesus the Nazarene," and he says, "Ego eimi, I am," and they all fall down. Remember that? In this sort of funny scene, but in my opinion, also a scene that reflects the majesty of God himself, at the expression of "I am," that all of these Gentiles and twisted up Jewish leaders fall down. The interesting thing is, after getting back up, they are asked the same question and answer it the same way. Who are you seeking? Jesus the Nazarene. Maybe brace themselves now, I don't know, but we saw and talked about how Jesus is making clear, like, yes, you're after me and me alone, so you're gonna leave all the rest of these disciples alone. You have no claim on them. Your claim is only for me. He was, again, protecting his disciples, and all would have gone well had Peter not been Peter. But Peter jeopardizes his safety when he takes his little steak knife and slices off the ear of the high priest's servant Malchus. He tried to ruin this peace that Jesus had just gained for him. But Jesus cleans up that mess also, doesn't he? Heals the servant's ear and spares Peter from death, at least at that point. Let us begin then again in John chapter 18, verse 12. If you're following through, hopefully you have your own Bibles. A couple spots we'll mark and highlight that we're going to pay special attention to. I'll point those out. Verse 12, so the band of soldiers and their captain, and again, that word in the Greek, captain, implies that these are Romans, that these are soldiers. That's the word used for the commander of a cohort. So we know these were Roman soldiers partly. The captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. Highlight, underline, circle, bound. It's going to be important for us. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Circle, underline, pay attention to that year. It was Caiaphas, who we talked about earlier, who had advised the Jews that it would be better, that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, already the imagery and the irony cannot be missed here. Jesus was bound, John says, the only gospel writer to include that little detail. That when Jesus was arrested, he was bound, and John includes that, no doubt, to take his readers back somewhere to another type of Christ, another foreshadowing of Christ, which was Isaac. That in the story of Isaac and Abraham, we remember in Genesis chapter 22, verse 9, when they had reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham had, of course, told Isaac, God himself will provide the sacrifice. We know in the story that he does provide the ram there, and he is at this very moment in our study of John providing the lamb for the sacrifice right now, that this is the lamb who was promised. That promise from Abraham to Isaac, although Isaac was bound, God himself will provide a sacrifice, is happening right now, this very moment in John. And as our familiar Psalm of Hallel, where we get the word hallelujah, our Psalm of praise, that Psalm 118, just a few verses after the stone that was rejected has come the chief cornerstone, says this, coincidentally enough. Psalm 118, verse 27, the Lord is God, and he has made his light to shine upon us. Bind the festal sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar. Speaking, of course, to the horns on the altar that was found in the tabernacle in the temple. And you would bring your sacrifice bound to the altar and to the priests for the sacrifice. Very clear what's happening here. Certainly the imagery that John's bringing to mind is this sacrificial lamb that is brought to the priest. The irony here should not be missed either, because the irony of the situation that is happening in our story right now is that the one true judge of the world is going to be judged by those who already have been judged. that the creator of the universe is going to sit in judgment before sinful man, his own creation. We know that not only is he the creator of the universe, but John has already told us in chapter 5, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. Paul writes to Timothy, in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who will judge the living and the dead. The only one who has the right to judge anyone else is going to sit in judgment. Because Jesus is God. Jesus is perfect, sinless man. He is the only one who has the right and the authority to judge, and yet he's going to sit in judgment. It's astonishingly ironic, if you will. Turns everything upside down, and it's fun that this is exactly what was prophesied also. As Isaiah the prophet wrote in chapter 29, you turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay? That's silly. That the thing made should say of its maker, he did not make me. Or the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding. That's ridiculous, right? What kind of a culture in a world would it be where the created things question whether there's a creator or not? How silly. That the created things would question the creator on how they've been made, or if they've been made at all. And yet this is exactly what we see. Now, humans judging God, that's just plain silly. But it happens every day. This is what's happening to Jesus. The question, though, is why did they take him to Annas first? Because we talked about how the sacrifice is bound and brought to the priest. And did you catch this in verse 13? First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. See, that year is important. That's the key to this, because Annas was the high priest for a number of years before this. And you know, within Jewish culture, within their ways of operation, the high priest was a lifetime appointment. So Annas had been the high priest, but wasn't anymore, and that's because the Romans came in and they decided to make it, if it wasn't already, surely they made it a political thing, that they wanted to appoint the high priest. And so they had different high priests appointed. Now, in this way, Annas, we see here, is still the one in power. He had 5 sons, 1 son-in-law, that's Caiaphas right now, and even 1 grandson who all served as the high priest, for all intents and purposes, under him. He's like the godfather, if you will. I'm trying to make, like, Annas is the godfather. He's still in control, and this is even true of the way he set up the temple and the system that he set up. Right, remember what was occurring in the court of the Gentiles in the temple now that caused Jesus to go in there and overturn the money changers, and he called it a den of thieves? It was called in their day the bazaars of Annas, not bazaars like that's weird, but the bazaars of like, this is like a flea market. And he's like the godfather. Like, oh, you know, what do you got there? Tony, what do you want to do? You want to set up a cannoli stand? That's good. That's good. I'll take 10%. You can set up your little cannoli. Now, obviously, they're not Italian. He's not the godfather. I'm trying to make it, see, you understand what's happening. You set up a little booth or whatever you want to set up in the court of Gentiles. I get a kickback. Annas is rich and powerful. And clearly the one in charge, because that's where Jesus is taken first, because Jesus coming in and making a stink and turning over the tables is gonna make Annas mad, because he's the godfather. He's the one that's in control of all of this. We've talked, like, this is the system that's set up. I bet lots of people from around the world that were coming back to Jerusalem for one of the pilgrimage festivals didn't even bother to drag along their own lamb for the sacrifice, because it's gonna be It's going to be rejected anyway. They're going to need to get a perfect, spotless, unblemished lamb from the approved lambs at the temple, those raised by the priests out of Bethlehem, right? So why would you even drag it along? But when you show up, you got to take the money that you have, that you transact with where you're from. Well, that's not good enough in the temple. Even if it's Roman money and we're under the Roman Empire, that's still not good enough money. So we got to exchange it at one of the money changers in the temple for a fee. Like I'm going to get taxed at the money changing. I'm going to get taxed higher at the buying the unblemished lamb, and all of that taxing helps go toward Annas. He's the godfather. He's in control. He's the one that Jesus is brought to first. We will see there in our story in John here, this scene that shifts back and forth between Jesus and then between Peter. Because where Jesus is brought then, we remember how the homes worked in that time, that there was like a compound, right? This complex where you'd have this courtyard in the middle and then you'd have the dwelling places around it, right? And so we're going to see Peter in the courtyard, and because they're family, Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, both their dwellings are in the same place. He's going to go from one to the other, but it's in the same place where Peter's going to be. And in our story in John, we're going to bounce back and forth to what's happening with Jesus, to what's happening with Peter, to what's happening with Jesus, to what's happening at Peter, because both of these interrogations, if you will, are happening at the same time. You follow me? Okay, so we see Jesus is brought to Annas, and then we see this in Peter. With Peter, not in Peter, we're still in John. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl. You may have questioned, like, why do you always say that one of the people that Peter denied to was this middle school aged girl? Because she was this middle school aged girl. Servant girl implies this young middle school aged girl who's kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Strike one. Seems so innocent and a passing detail. You're not one of this man's disciples too, are you? No, I'm not. That's one. Now, the servants and the officers made a charcoal, circle, underline, highlight, star, charcoal. There's a juicy little nugget that we're going to have at the end with that one. You're not expecting. Made a charcoal fire because it was cold. That makes sense. Because it was cold, you make a fire. But a charcoal fire here. And they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself, which I think, again, just as an aside, is another little eyewitness detail. It's like, why specify that unless you saw it? And that's what happened. Now our scene shifts back to Jesus. Verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret." So truth, there is absolutely no reason to question Jesus about his teaching because he never taught in secret. As we looked at with Paul last week before Agrippa, right? I'm convinced that you're aware of these things because none of it was done in a corner. Jesus didn't teach in secret. He taught out in the open for everyone to see and hear. So there's no reason for Annas to question Jesus on this. But there's a legal issue here that's important for us to look at, that Jesus is pointing out. Because he says this next, "Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." The key is in, why do you ask me? And that's key because Annas technically is not allowed to ask Jesus anything in this trial. Their law prohibited the one who was on trial from incriminating themselves at all. It's like our Fifth Amendment, right? Furthermore, you're not even allowed to ask the one who's on trial any questions until a certain point of the trial. And for all intents and purposes, Jesus isn't even on trial yet. And so this is a rebuke by Jesus to Annas, which is going to go over like a lead balloon, but still, he's reminding Annas that he has no right. In fact, William Barclay, the Bible scholar, in a book called The Gospel of John, which is titled appropriately, said this: one curious feature of legal procedure in the Sanhedrin, and again, the Sanhedrin is that ruling class, like the Supreme Court, the final deciders of all things in legality and importance to the Jews. One curious feature, he says, of procedure within the Sanhedrin is that the man involved was held to be absolutely innocent, and indeed, not even on trial until the evidence of the witnesses had been stated and confirmed. So the argument about the case could only begin when they had witnesses and those witnesses were confirmed. So this is Jesus reminding, like, where are the witnesses? I'm not even on trial here yet. You have no right to ask me a question. Now, and we know in regard to the witnesses, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and the Old Testament law specifies that it's not just one witness. You got to have two, better even three witnesses that are confirmed, checked out, accurate, and then you can have yourself a trial. No witnesses had even been presented yet. Jesus is arrested and brought immediately into the presence of Annas and asked to incriminate himself. And the reality here is, and I'm sure you've heard it a number of times, that what happens right now on this night with these trials before the Jews, before Annas and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, that there are a number of their own laws, a bunch of illegalities that take place here in the trial of Jesus. Let me name some of them for you. He was arrested through a bribe, blood money. It's illegal. Number two, he was arrested without a clear charge. Number three, trials could not be held at night or during festivals. This was at night and during a festival. Double bad. Double fault. Double illegal. Night and festival. They used physical force to try to intimidate him. You'll see this in a second. Number five, false witnesses offered conflicting testimony. Number six, witnesses are not supposed to testify in front of each other. That's a novel idea. That's going to be broken. Jesus was asked to incriminate himself. Jesus wasn't given the opportunity to cross-examine. There was no call for a vote. He was charged with blasphemy, but then presented to Pilate under a different charge. So the charge is changed. Number 11, he was convicted and executed the same day as his trial. All of these things were illegal according to their own law and way of doing things. And there's a tendency sometimes, even amongst Christians, to get really upset about this. And in fact, the truth of what happens here and how the Jewish leaders twisted their own law and did all of these illegal things to put Jesus to death is used as a platform for anti-Semitism, which is crazy to me, but it's true. And some of you may even be familiar with it. Like throughout history, these Jewish leaders, these perpetrators of this crime against Jesus, are seen as a basis for treating all Jews in a way to breed anti-Semitism. The thing that's crazy about that is like Are you saying that Jesus shouldn't have been killed? Because I'm actually kind of glad that Jesus was killed. Furthermore, how else would you get a guilty conviction of Jesus unless by doing something illegal? Furthermore, it sort of implies that Jesus is not in control, that somehow Jesus has been arrested and he didn't want to be, but didn't have the power to stop it, and now he's being tried illegally and he's going to be executed illegally and he can't do anything about it. Furthermore, it sort of implies that those Jewish leaders are responsible for killing Jesus and you're not. Like, the whole argument to me is like, what? You're mad at the Jewish leaders for trying Jesus illegally and putting him to death. Was there another answer to this thing? Furthermore, aren't you responsible for killing Jesus? How do we put it on Jewish leaders when we know it's because of sin and we know that all have fallen short of the glory of God and all are guilty of sin? Like, how is it we separate and segregate and like blame Jews for killing Jesus when we're the ones that killed Jesus? It's just crazy. It's crazy to me, but we're humans, so we do crazy stuff, right? The truth is, every sin that you have committed is the reason that Jesus was killed. Not anybody else, not the Jews, not your neighbors, not your brother, not your wife. You are the reason Jesus was killed. Nay, Jesus gave himself up willingly, amen, because he loves you. How can we put that on anybody else? But I digress. When, verse 22, when Jesus had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. If what I said is wrong, tell me how I'm wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas realized this is going nowhere and I've made a huge mistake. Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest, which is, I guess, where he should have gone in the first place, but this is kind of like an oopsie. Now, as another aside, sort of sidetrack, we see here just the start of Jesus is our model, amen, of how to respond to persecution, how to respond to lies told about you, how to respond to being slandered online, how to respond to being abused, how to respond to being falsely accused, how to respond to being unjustly vilified. He is our example. And Peter sees it. This is the point, right? That he's in the courtyard, he sees what's going on with Jesus, and Peter sees it and then writes down later in 1 Peter chapter 2, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Again, Jesus is our model. And I know that I respond usually just like Jesus, which is when I'm insulted, when I'm lied about online, when I'm slandered, I respond in grace and love and forgiveness. And I know you struggle with that, so I'm gonna keep you in my prayers. Because you can all learn from Jesus. We can all learn from Jesus in this. Now, John doesn't record, as he often does, he does different things. John doesn't record any of this trial. Jesus is sent to Caiaphas, then he's going to be sent before the whole Sanhedrin. John doesn't record any of the details of these two trials. He's going to go straight to Pilate, which we'll see next week. They have to appeal him to Pilate because we know even if they get a guilty verdict that deserves capital punishment to be killed, that the Jews can't carry that out on their own because they were not allowed to kill anyone themselves. It had to be done by Rome, so they have to appeal it to Rome. But we see within the trial of Caiaphas, and we'll probably get into this a little bit next week too, that indeed false witnesses are brought, that they have trouble finding witnesses that they can get to agree on what Jesus did, and they even end up misquoting him. Like, he said he was going to destroy the temple, when what he really said is, when you destroy the temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. But Jesus finally confesses to being the Messiah. So they consider that blasphemy, which it would be if he wasn't really the Messiah. But this is what happens with Caiaphas. There's this sham. There's some more punching of Jesus, some more abuse. There's some more false witnesses brought. Finally, he confesses to being the Messiah, and then he sends him to Pilate. We'll pick that up next week. But instead, John goes back to Peter. Again, in the same complex with Annas and Caiaphas, because he's sent from Annas to Caiaphas. Peter's still there in the courtyard, yeah? So John goes back to Peter. Verse 25, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I'm not. One of the servants of the high priest, I love this. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, hey, didn't I see you in the garden with him? Like, I'm related to the dude whose ear you cut off. Didn't I see you in the garden? Peter again denied it. And at once a rooster crowed. What's fascinating to me is this rivalry that we've talked about, this thing that John and Peter have going on. It's like the way that John records this is fascinating to me. Because he's the one that threw Peter under the bus. It's like, yeah, that's, and even did so again here. Peter, whose ear he had cut off. Like, John names him. We saw last week, John's the one that, like, Peter's old and slow. I beat him to the tomb. Let me remind you again, I arrived at the tomb first because Peter's old and slow. But here in this huge thing that just happened, the magnitude of what just happened is amazing. And all John says is, Peter denied it. Didn't I see you? And we don't even have a response, just that he denied it and a rooster crowed. It's fascinating to me because this is exactly what Jesus said was going to happen, right? Back a couple chapters ago in John, I'll never leave you. I'll go to my death for you. I'll defend you. No, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows tonight. Oh, I'll never do that. It's exactly what just happened. And this is an absolutely important eyewitness detail too, because a disciple, a student denying their rabbi, their teacher, is the most shameful thing that you can do in that culture, in that relationship. It would be unheard of for if they were making this up, again, hundreds of years later, to include the story, oh yeah, one of the students denied the teacher. I mean, that's the most shameful thing you can do. To deny even knowing your teacher? What just happened here is enormous. This is the worst imaginable offense in this rabbi Talmudim, this teacher-student relationship. And the synoptics make a much bigger deal of this. And so I want to include that, but specifically how Luke records this, I want to share something with you. So in Luke chapter 22, verse 60, and this is that third question. This is that third opportunity for Peter to deny. This is Peter's response. Luke records, man, I do not know what you're talking about, which is much more than just John recording Peter denied it. But Matthew and Mark even say at this point, the third time is when Peter calls down curses and swears. So this third denial is literally Peter going, I swear on my mother's grave. If I'm lying, I'm dying. If I'm lying, may lightning strike, right? I swear to God. Cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. This is what Peter's saying. May I be cursed if I'm lying. I swear to you I'm telling the truth. I don't know the man. And then Luke records this little nugget. So he curses and he swears, I don't know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Can you even? Like, seriously, can you imagine this? I've got this picture in my mind. Jesus is being tried, falsely accused. He's already been slapped. He's going to get punched. There's this thing going on. Peter's in the courtyard warming himself, and he's being asked by middle school girls and some other servants, hey, didn't I see you there? Hey, I'm related to the dude that got his ear cut off. Wasn't that you? I swear to God, I don't know what you're talking about. Rooster crows, Jesus looks over at you, like makes eye contact with you. Can you imagine? I don't even know the man. Then Peter, like Jesus, he's gonna get killed, and you're standing there with the, can you imagine that? Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Yeah, I bet. You want to talk about brokenness? Can you, like I'm like, this cuts me, man. I relate to this. Like, I just see this scene, him just being this, I don't know what you're talking about. I swear to God, I've never seen this man. I don't know the man. And then the rooster crows and you look and Jesus is looking right at you. I mean, Jesus denies nothing and Peter denies everything. I guess I relate to this because maybe I don't and have never said, like, you Christian, you know this Jesus guy. I swear to God, I've never said that or done that, right? I've never used those words. But I know I've gossiped. I know I've lied. I know I've cheated. I know I've stolen. I know I've withheld forgiveness. I know I've lusted. I know I've hated. And even though I don't use those words, aren't I in fact denying that I know Jesus by my actions? Is that not you sometimes? I mean, maybe you've never said, I don't know the dude, man. That wasn't me in the garden. I don't know what you're talking about. But don't you also deny that you know Jesus when you have hatred toward a brother or sister, when you gossip, when you say things that aren't true? Well, it was just a little white lie. Well, I just looked for a minute. Didn't harm anybody. Well, nobody was using that thing anyway, so I took it. Aren't you denying that you know Jesus? Aren't we, Peter? So now we're going to close and have communion. Nah, we are going to have communion, but who wants to end a sermon like that? Right? Let me give you some hope. So we don't leave completely in despair. We're going to go back to our little word, charcoal. Charcoal is the Greek word used there, anthrax. And I think because what anthrax is the boils that you end up getting look like charcoal, where they're black and then surrounded by the kind of white on the outside. That's the kind of boils that anthrax brings. But literally it's charcoal. That's the Greek word that's used there. The thing that's fascinating is that word in the entire Bible is only used twice. Once, right here, where Peter's warming himself in the courtyard in front of the charcoal fires. Like, why did he say that? Maybe it was to bring us to the other place that that word is used, and that's in John 21. John's the only one in the Bible that uses it. He uses it twice, right there with Peter, and now the only other place it's used in John 21:9. When they had landed, they saw a fire of burning anthrax coals there with fish on it and some bread. What's the context? They've all left. They're out fishing. They see on the shore, there's a dude cooking a meal. Hey, that's Jesus. What happens? Peter jumps out of the boat, swims to shore, and then what happens when he's sitting in front of the charcoal fire now with Jesus, who, when last time he was in front of the charcoal fire, he locked eyes with Jesus because he had just denied him for the third time. Now Peter walks up on the beach, sits down, has a meal with Jesus, and Jesus restores him 3 times. See, I love this story because I don't want to leave us in despair with, yes, we all deny, but the truth of the matter is, Peter did the most shameful thing you could do to Jesus, and Jesus restored him. Yes, you're going to deny him. But that's the reason we celebrate Jesus. Because like Peter, he forgives us, he redeems us, he restores us. I love how John does that. We got him and he locks eyes, and I've denied him for the 3rd time. And the next time we see it, Jesus is restoring him 3 times. That the most shameful thing you could do, he's restored and forgiven.